At first light, Staff Sergeant Jared Nguyen moved before the tomb with the exactness of a vow made visible, his boots clicking in perfect rhythm across black mat and pale stone. 21 steps, pause, turn, repeat. Mist drifted low against the marble. The crowd did not speak. In that cold morning hush, Arlington sounded like memory breathing. The hill carried the kind of autumn chill that settled into cuffs and collars, a crisp weight that woke the lungs and sharpened every outline. Rows of white headstones rolled away in measured lines, each marker catching the weak dawn like quiet fire, each name and blank face turned toward a nation still sleeping. Above them, the first color of sunrise thinned from slate to silver behind the bare-limbed trees, and the wind moved gently enough to stir only coat hems and flag edges. Nothing here rushed. Even the birds seemed to cross the sky with restraint, as if they understood where they were. Jared's silhouette cut through that stillness with ceremonial precision. 6'2", broad through the shoulders, built like a wall that had learned to walk upright, he wore the uniform as if it had been forged around him. His kepi sat at a perfect angle. His white gloves were pristine. His coat was pressed so hard every crease looked sharp enough to cut glass, brass catching a dim gleam with each turn. The polished black of his boots held the light in narrow strips as he planted each step. The M14 rested in practiced control, balanced and steady, no wasted movement, no flourish. To the visitors gathered beyond the rope line, he looked carved from discipline. To the dead he honored, he was a living promise. The cadence reset. 21 steps, a pause, a turn, then the next cycle. A father in a Navy windbreaker stood with one arm around his daughter's shoulders. Both of them still now, the girl's fingers curled around a program she had stopped fidgeting with minutes ago. Near them, 2 high school boys who had arrived whispering and half laughing, lowered their phones and let them hang at their sides, their faces quieted by the cadence of boots on stone. An elderly couple in matching caps embroidered with unit insignia stood hand in hand. The man's knuckles pale from age and weather, the woman's chin lifted as if answering a roll call only she could hear. On the outer edge of the crowd, a middle-aged nurse in hospital scrubs beneath a jacket bowed her head every time Jared paused at the mat's edge, her lips moving with words no one else could make out. A few yards behind them sat a little girl in a wheelchair, no older than 8, wrapped in a red scarf too large for her shoulders. A folded flag pin fastened carefully to her sweater. Her mother kept one hand on the chair handle, and the other around a paper cup gone cold, eyes fixed forward, jaw set in the way of people who had learned how to stand up straight through grief. The girl watched Jared without blinking. She counted with him under her breath, one finger tapping each number against the armrest, then stopping at 21, waiting through the pause, beginning again when he turned. She did not smile. She looked solemn, attentive, the way children do when they understand they have stepped into a place that asks for their best behavior and gives them something larger than themselves in return. To their right, a retired Marine with oxygen tubing looped over both ears stood with one hand braced on a cane, stubbornly refusing the folding chair his son had brought. The clear line from tank to nose trembled with his breathing, but he remained upright through every cycle, eyes fixed on Jared's route. A faded tattoo climbed from under his sleeve, ink blurred by decades and sun. Once, when Jared's heel struck with a crisp report that echoed off the marble, the old Marine gave a faint nod, not to the crowd, not to the family beside him, but to the rhythm itself as if acknowledging a standard met. By 6:10 a.m., the mist had thinned and settled in low ribbons around the steps, but the silence held. Jared felt every shift in that crowd without ever looking at them directly. That was part of the craft civilians never saw. His face stayed unreadable, eyes aligned on a point only he could see. But inside his attention tracked everything in arcs and distances. The scrape of a shoe on gravel beyond the rope, the faint click of a camera shutter 2 rows back, the pressure of wind against his right sleeve before each turn. His breathing stayed controlled and quiet, paced to discipline rather than comfort. Years of patrols, checkpoints, and convoys had taught his nervous system to read the world in fractions of seconds, to separate harmless motion from hazard before thought had time to form. Here, on this mat, those instincts did not disappear. They were consecrated. He reached the end of the lane, executed the pause, and turned with rifle to the outside shoulder, a geometry of respect refined by repetition and scrutiny. The movement was clean enough that a young intern in a camel coat sucked in her breath without realizing she had done it. Nearby, a veteran in a leather jacket touched 2 fingers to the brim of his cap and then lowered his hand. A tour guide who had spoken softly for 10 minutes gave up trying and simply stood with his script folded in his pocket, understanding that the ceremony needed no narration. The tomb rose ahead of Jared in pale, severe strength, marble faces carrying carved words that were less inscription than charge. The stone looked almost translucent in the growing light, as if it held dawn inside itself. Beyond and below, thousands of headstones marched over Arlington's slopes in unwavering order, white against damp green, each one a life reduced to carved lines and dates, each one proof that history demanded witnesses as much as warriors. This was not a stage and not a museum. It was a boundary between forgetting and remembrance, and every cycle of 21 steps marked that boundary anew. A boy in a Little League jacket tugged his grandfather's sleeve and whispered, "Why does he do it the same every time?" The older man leaned down, voice barely audible. "Because some things don't get done halfway." The boy looked back at Jared and straightened his own posture, mimicking the stance without being told. Jared completed another pass, heel strike precise, shoulders level, chin set. Sweat did not show in the cool air, but tension lived in muscle and tendon, held in reserve behind composure. His left knee carried an old ache that woke in changing weather. His jaw bore a thin white scar under the right side, mostly hidden unless the light hit it at an angle. None of it touched his cadence. The ritual did not bend to pain, memory, or mood. That was the point. The sentinel's body might carry private history, but the duty belonged to something far older and far greater than private comfort. Across the rope line, a journalist with a press badge clipped to her lapel lowered her notebook and stopped writing. For several minutes, she simply watched, pen uncapped in her hand, expression moved from professional focus to something quieter. Beside her, a young staffer in a congressional lanyard glanced at his phone, then locked the screen and slipped it into his pocket, gaze returning to the mat with a seriousness he had not brought with him. In another setting, they would have argued policy, numbers, and priorities. Here, under the flag and morning sky, they stood in common silence, united by a discipline none of them had earned, but all of them recognized. The wind shifted from the north. The flag snapped once, clean and hard, then settled. Jared turned on count. The rifle stock aligned exactly, white glove fixed at the same angle it had held on every cycle before. No part of him asked for attention. No part of him performed for applause. This was stewardship, not spectacle. His stillness between motions carried the same force as movement, a controlled suspension that made the next step feel inevitable, lawful, right? 21 steps, pause, turn, repeat. The little girl in the wheelchair leaned forward as far as her belt allowed and whispered the count again, lips shaping each number with care. Her mother noticed and pressed a hand gently to her shoulder, then, after a moment, nodded permission for her to keep going. The retired Marine heard her and looked over, eyes softening. He shifted his cane, drew one steady breath through the tubing, and joined in under his breath on the final 3 counts, the two of them linked by cadence across half a century of American wars. Somewhere down the hill, a maintenance cart hummed and faded. A church bell from beyond the cemetery grounds rang the quarter hour, thin and distant. Jared's timing did not move a fraction. He reached the edge, paused, turned. The polished leather of his boots met stone with a report so exact it seemed to strike not only the ear but the sternum, a percussive reminder that honor had weight, measure, and cost. By 6:34 a.m., the sun had cleared the tree line and painted the marble in pale gold, but the reverence remained unbroken. What the crowd witnessed looked ceremonial, almost untouched by the noise of modern life. What they felt, even if they could not name it, was defense, not the defense of walls or borders, but of memory itself. Jared's expression never changed. His gaze stayed locked. His cadence did not falter. Yet beneath that controlled exterior ran a current of vigilant purpose, the same current that had carried him across foreign dust and fire, now transformed into deliberate peace on sacred ground. He completed another turn, another measured passage, and Arlington held its breath with him, as if the whole hillside understood that this ritual was not about pageantry at all, but about keeping faith with those who no longer had a voice. Then the sacred hill released him to the profane world that always waited below it. Jared completed another pass, another turn, another measured pause, and when the relief commander's timing aligned with the ritual down to the heartbeat, he stepped out of the lane without flourish, rifle still chin level, discipline intact. By 7:03 a.m., he was moving through corridors of stone and shadow toward a vehicle bound for the Capitol, dress blues immaculate, jaw set over the thin, pale scar under his right side, silence wrapped around him like a second uniform. Washington had fully woken by the time they reached the hearing building. Traffic pulsed. Camera crews crowded the curb behind portable barricades. Staffers in tailored coats moved quickly with binders tucked to their chests, while veterans in old unit caps walked at a slower pace, shoulders squared by habit, eyes narrowed with the wary patience of men and women who had learned how often sacrifice became a line item in someone else's spreadsheet. The hearing room itself was already overfull. Reporters shoulder to shoulder in the back row, interns standing along the walls with tablets lit, Gold Star families seated near the center, with hands folded over service programs, and 2 committee aides whispering over printed amendments that had been marked and remarked in red. Jared took the witness seat when directed and did not shift once afterward. In Arlington, he had carried the M14. Here he carried stillness. His coat sat perfectly on his frame, brass bright under committee lights, white gloves resting against his knees without a tremor. To people who had never stood a watchpost under pressure, he looked ornamental, ceremonial, another symbol polished for cameras. To anyone who had worn body armor in heat that made breathing feel like work, he looked like what he was, a man controlling every visible signal so that no one in the room could mistake calm for weakness. The chairman called the session to order. The budget tables appeared on overhead screens in neat columns and precise figures. A senior analyst discussed operational costs in a neutral tone. A veteran nurse gave short testimony about family visits to Arlington and the educational value of ceremonial standards for young service members. For 12 minutes, the room ran on procedure and paper, and the friction stayed mostly hidden beneath parliamentary language. Then Congressman Blaine Mercer leaned forward, and the temperature changed. Mercer wore a charcoal suit, cut like armor, and platinum cufflinks that caught every flash from the press row. He had built his reputation on televised certainty, on speaking in blunt declarations that made complexity sound like weakness. 3 seats down from the chairman, he drummed his fingers once on the dais, glanced toward the cameras as if checking that they were awake, and slid a printed card toward himself with a practiced little motion that suggested he had rehearsed this line in a mirror. When his turn came, he did not begin with numbers. He began with contempt. "Let's stop pretending," he said, voice sharp enough to slice through the room's careful cadence. "This is ceremonial waste." The word struck like a dropped metal tray in a chapel. Reporters looked up from laptops. A Gold Star mother in the second row inhaled and held it. One intern's stylus stopped mid-note. Mercer's palm came down flat on the wood, hard, a crack that snapped every loose conversation in half, and then he pointed across the chamber directly at Jared, as if identifying an exhibit, not a soldier. "Parade boy pageantry," Mercer said. "That's what taxpayers are funding." The chamber froze. It froze in the exact way crowds freeze when they realize they are no longer watching policy, but witnessing a line being crossed in public. Phones rose along the back wall almost in unison, tiny glass rectangles lifting into the air like a second set of eyes. A retired sergeant first class in a tan blazer stood halfway, and then sat again when an aide touched his sleeve. A teenage congressional intern mouthed what sounded like "no way" and forgot to lower her hand. One reporter whispered, "Did he just say that?" and got no answer because no one trusted their voice in that instant. Jared did not move. He did not flinch, did not blink harder, did not tighten his jaw for the cameras, waiting to capture anger. His face remained a mask of discipline. Eyes locked forward, shoulders level, posture exact. But inside that composure, training that had been forged in Hellman compounds and Syrian road checks went instantly live. He tracked Mercer's breathing rhythm, the chairman's grip on the gavel, the location of every guard in the room, the probability curve of where the moment would break next. He measured the room in fractions. He counted exits without turning his head. He let the insult pass through him and dissipate, because he had learned long ago that the first man to lose control usually lost the mission. What Mercer did not know would have humbled him even if there had been no cameras and no crowd to impress. He did not know that the man he called a prop had spent years reading threat indicators faster than most people read a headline. He did not know Jared could pick out panic from outrage by listening to how a chair scraped against tile. He did not know there was already footage in circulation from Reagan National that he believed he controlled, and that the clip he planned to weaponize had 16 missing seconds, carrying enough context to collapse his entire argument in one pass. The chairman struck the gavel once. "Order," he said. But the word arrived late, a command chasing a shockwave. Murmurs rippled from the last row to the witness rail and back again. A veteran with oxygen tubing, same man who had stood through dawn at Arlington, cane now hooked over his forearm, stared at Mercer with a look so steady it needed no speech. Near the side aisle, the little girl in the wheelchair sat beside her mother, folded flag pin fixed to her sweater, eyes locked on Jared as if she were still counting his steps in her head and waiting for him to reach the turn point. Mercer leaned back, satisfied with the damage, and gestured toward the monitors. "We have video," he said, voice louder now, feeding on the room. "The American people can judge for themselves what this theater looks like." A committee technician hesitated before touching the controls. For one long beat, nothing played. Jared kept his breathing even. The chairman's counsel bent toward him and whispered urgently. Two network producers near the rear doorway exchanged looks that said this hearing had already left the rails and entered the bloodstream of the country. And in the center of it all sat the sentinel from Arlington, perfectly still while the room spun faster around him. That was where the pressure peaked, right before consequences started moving in from outside the frame. That was where the story needed to pause, not because the stakes were unclear, but because they were finally clear enough to deserve their full weight. The screen flickered to life with a timestamp in the corner and washed the chamber in cold airport fluorescence. Grainy security footage showed a concourse outside a secured corridor at Reagan National. Rolling luggage, a knot of travelers, two uniformed escorts, and Jared in dress blues moving with the same clipped precision he carried at the tomb. The clip started mid-motion, exactly where Mercer wanted it to start. A man in a ball cap lurched into frame. Jared stepped in hard. The image froze on impact, the angle flattering chaos and hiding sequence. "There," Mercer said, stabbing a finger at the screen. "Federal resources diverted to ceremonial vanity. And this is what we get. An armed escort roughing up civilians in a public terminal." Noise rose again, sharper this time because now everyone could see something and half the room misunderstood it instantly. A reporter near the center aisle was already typing with both thumbs, drafting the headline before context could catch up. One of the high school boys from Arlington, now squeezed into the back row between two standing staffers, shook his head and whispered, "That's not what happened," though he had no microphone and no authority to lend the words weight. The journalist with the press badge lowered her pen completely and watched the freeze frame without blinking. The chairman looked to Jared. "Staff Sergeant Nguyen," he said, measured but tight. "You will have an opportunity to respond. Congressman Mercer, unfreeze the exhibit and run full speed." Mercer did not touch the control pad. "That frame is the point," he replied. "Taxpayers deserve clarity." "They deserve sequence," the chairman said, louder now. "Run it." The technician obeyed. The clip advanced 3 seconds, enough to show the man in the cap stumbling backward into stanchions, enough to preserve Mercer's accusation, still not enough to explain why Jared had moved. Then the feed cut to black with an error banner across the top. "File end." A murmur rolled through the gallery like wind across dry grass. Counsel leaned into microphones. A clerk checked the drive and frowned. The chairman's expression changed from irritation to suspicion. Jared finally spoke, voice calm and carrying without strain. "Mr. Chairman, request permission to identify the missing interval." Mercer snapped back before the chair could answer. "Missing interval. We submitted complete materials to committee." Jared kept his eyes forward. "Respectfully, Congressman, the uploaded file begins 16 seconds late." The number landed harder than any insult had. 16 seconds was too specific to bluff, too short to look like a random glitch, too long to conceal motive. One of the committee aides who had been whispering over marked amendments stopped whispering entirely and began scrolling through metadata on a tablet. At the far wall, the young congressional staffer who had earlier put his phone away did not reach for it now. He watched the monitors with his hands flat at his sides, as if he understood that witnessing required discipline too. The chairman conferred with counsel, then nodded once. "Do you have direct knowledge of those 16 seconds, Staff Sergeant?" "I was present," Jared said. "I engaged a moving threat vector approaching a family cluster and an unattended bag inside a controlled corridor. Federal Protective Service cleared the scene at 9:17:20. The submitted clip begins at 9:17:36. A silence fell that was different from shock. This one had shape. In the second row, the little girl's mother closed her eyes briefly and opened them again, shoulders straightening as if a weight had shifted from one side to the other. The retired Marine with oxygen tubing gave one small nod, almost imperceptible, the kind men used when words would only reduce the thing they meant. Mercer tried to recover the frame. "Alleged threat vector," he said, stressing each syllable. "We are not in a combat zone." "No, sir," Jared replied, same even tone. "We are in a hearing room discussing readiness standards. Sequence still matters." The chairman raised the gavel but did not strike. "Counsel, authenticate source logs. Technician, hold all playback pending verification. Sergeant Nguyen, remain available." Jared inclined his head once. He did not look toward Mercer, did not look toward the cameras, did not look toward the gallery where veterans and families sat in rigid silence. He fixed on a point just above the witness rail and waited, every line of his posture saying the same thing his pacing at Arlington had said since first light. Count the steps, hold the line, do not drift. He fixed on a point just above the witness rail and waited, and the room, denied immediate spectacle, settled into a sharper kind of attention. The committee technicians swapped drives with careful hands. Counsel moved between stations, requesting source hashes, chain logs, intake timestamps. No one pretended this was routine anymore. The overhead lights hummed. The air carried coffee gone bitter in paper cups, printer toner, wool coats damp from the morning chill outside. In the back row, cameras stayed raised, but the operators stopped narrating into their mics and simply watched. The chairman spoke without looking away from the monitors. "While authentication proceeds, we will establish context for the record. Staff Sergeant Nguyen remains seated." "Yes, Mr. Chairman." It was the same voice that had cut through airport noise and cemetery wind. Measured, formal, stripped of anything extra. He sat as if his spine had been drawn with a straight edge. His coat lay without a ripple across his shoulders. The brass on his buttons held steady points of white light. White gloves rested flat, one atop the other, exactly centered. His kepi shadowed his eyes just enough to make them unreadable from the gallery, though those closest could see their stillness was not vacancy but control. At the far side of the room, the little girl in the wheelchair leaned forward, scarf slipping loose at one shoulder. Her mother adjusted it with automatic tenderness and kept her own gaze on Jared, chin high, grief and composure sharing the same posture. 2 rows behind them, the retired Marine shifted his cane from right hand to left, oxygen tubing trembling lightly with each breath, eyes fixed on the witness table. Along the wall, young staffers and other visitors stood squeezed between interns with badges and veterans with unit pins. All of them packed shoulder to shoulder in a chamber built for procedure and suddenly carrying the weight of testimony. Outside those walls, Arlington still existed in the same morning light that had first defined the day. The hill, the marble, the white ranks of headstones, the wind moving through bare branches with a low, patient sound. Inside Jared, that landscape remained present down to texture and temperature. He could still feel the cool bite at his cuffs from first light, hear the heel strike echo from black mat to stone, see mist burn off the tomb in thin ribbons as the sun climbed. The hearing room's fluorescent glare did not erase that memory. It sharpened the contrast. The sacred ground and public argument. Vow and ledger. Silence earned and noise manufactured. By 9:42 a.m., even the reporters had stopped typing in full sentences and shifted to fragments, waiting for facts to lock in place before committing language to the national feed. The chairman looked to committee counsel, received a nod that meant the verification process needed more minutes, then turned back to Jared. For the record, state your assignment and ceremonial qualifications. Jared answered without hesitation. Staff Sergeant Jared Nguyen, United States Army, 3rd U.S. Infantry Regiment, the Old Guard. Current assignment, Tomb Sentinel Detail. Mercer exhaled through his nose, audibly impatient, but did not interrupt. Describe your morning duty posture, the chairman said. Jared did not embellish. Uniform inspection to standard. Kepi set and verified. Gloves and brass checked. Rifle balance and cadence confirmed. Relief executed on schedule. 21-step sequence maintained. He said it like reciting coordinates. No drama, just fact. The gallery heard more than words. They pictured it because many of them had seen it hours earlier. The polished boots reflecting pale dawn, every crease in his coat sharp enough to cut glass, the white gloves pristine against dark wool, the M14 steady as if bolted to intention itself. The nurse in scrubs from Arlington sat near the aisle now and pressed 2 fingers to her lips, then lowered her hand, eyes wet but steady. A young intern who had arrived with policy binders and skepticism stared at Jared's sleeves, noticing for the first time the tiny details civilians missed, the exact angle of seam lines, the absolute absence of slack, the way discipline appeared in cloth before it appeared in action. The chairman continued. Explain to this committee why ceremonial precision matters to operational readiness. A lesser witness might have reached for slogans. Jared gave architecture. Precision is behavior under standard. Standard under stress becomes trust. At the tomb, that trust honors the fallen. In uniformed service, the same trust keeps people alive. No one moved for a beat. In the silence, Arlington seemed to enter the room fully. The white headstones like silent sentinels over rolling ground. Families standing in coats with hands clasped. Children learning stillness by imitation. Veterans carrying private histories behind calm faces. The tomb itself, pale and severe, less monument than mandate. A place where memory was not abstract, where discipline was visible and therefore teachable. The chairman let that settle, then said, describe the crowd composition during your morning watch. Jared's eyes remained fixed forward. Multi-generational civilian attendance. Gold Star family present. Elderly veteran requiring oxygen support present. Student group present. Press observer present. The little girl's mother drew one breath, long and controlled, when she heard herself and her daughter included in a military inventory of significance, not as spectators, as people accounted for. Mercer shifted in his seat, cufflinks flashing. This is mythology, he said, too loud, trying to reclaim momentum. We are discussing appropriations. The chairman did strike the gavel this time. You will have your turn, Congressman. The room obeyed. Even Mercer, jaw set, went still. Counsel crossed to the witness table and placed a binder in front of the chairman. Metadata retrieval in progress, she said softly. Recommend continued record development. The chairman nodded. Staff Sergeant, provide service background. That was the doorway into the deeper ledger, and when Jared stepped through it, the chamber's energy changed from outrage to witness. Enlisted at 19, he said. Infantry track, first deployment, Helmand Province. Helmand, second deployment. Helmand Province, third deployment, northern Syria. Bronze Star awarded for casualty extraction during vehicle ignition event. The phrase vehicle ignition event carried no flourish, but the people in uniform heard what lived inside it. Heat, smoke, seconds, decisions. He continued. Sustained shrapnel laceration below right mandible during second deployment. Returned to duty after treatment. Later screened and selected for Old Guard assignment. The chairman leaned forward slightly. Why request tomb duty? For the first time, Jared paused longer than protocol required. Not uncertainty, wait. Because of Specialist Owen Callahan, he said. Nickname Pike. He did not look down. He did not close his eyes. He gave the name the way a sentinel presents arms. Exact, intentional, complete. In Jared's memory, Pike was always moving, always carrying some small current of humor into places that did not deserve laughter, but needed it anyway. In Hellman's Dust and Heat, with rotor wash slamming grit into teeth and eyelids, Pike had balanced an MRE spoon on his nose to make two exhausted privates laugh before patrol. In a plywood chow shelter where every tray clatter sounded like fatigue, he once dropped his own meal, saluted the spilled potatoes, and said, "Gentlemen, behold my tactical surrender to gravy." Men who had not smiled in days had laughed then, brief and grateful, before stepping back into a landscape that punished distraction. The hearing room stayed silent as Jared spoke, and the silence held because he was not performing grief. He was recording it. Pike was from western Pennsylvania, Jared said. Could fix radios with a paperclip and bad language he never used around kids. Wrote letters to his mother every Sunday, even on movement days. In Sanjan sector, prior to route clearance, he told me, "If I ever go first, don't let me be forgotten in a quiet room." The line landed like a bell stroke. Jared's jaw tightened once, almost invisible. The thin scar under the right side caught the overhead light when he turned half a degree toward the chairman, a pale seam from Erline toward a throat. It had come months after Pike's last patrol, during a convoy hit that lit the vehicle column in sudden orange and concussion. Jared had gone back into heat and smoke for two men trapped by harness and twisted frame, one conscious and calling, one dazed and unable to free his leg. He had cut one strap blind, dragged one soldier clear by plate carrier handle, then returned for the second as ammunition cooked off in the wreck. He remembered impact, shouted distances, metal giving way, and then a medic's gloved hand pressing gauze against his neck, while someone said, "Stay with me, Sergeant." He had stayed. So had both men he pulled out. He did not offer that sequence as heroics. The chairman had asked for background, and background in uniform was built from the names you carried and the moments you survived. After Callahan was killed by an IED, Jared said, each word level, I requested assignment where remembrance was active duty, not a ceremony on calendar days. At the tomb, every pass is counted. Every turn is deliberate. You stand watch for those whose names were never brought home. That fulfilled the promise. In the gallery, the retired Marine lifted his chin, eyes bright and hard at once. The nurse in scrubs bowed her head. One young staffer wiped his face quickly and looked irritated at himself for doing it. The journalist who had stopped writing at Arlington resumed now, but slowly, as if she understood she was taking down testimony and not content. Mercer muttered to an aide, words too low to catch, then reached for his water and found his hand less steady than before. The chairman asked one more question. "Staff Sergeant, when civilians call your duty symbolic, what do you say?" Jared's answer came in one line, quiet and immovable. "Symbol is what memory looks like from far away. Up close, it is work." No one argued with him. At 9:51 a.m., committee counsel received a message, checked the attached file, and walked directly to the chairman with a face that had lost all trace of routine. She slid a printed sheet across the dais, then whispered 5 words that traveled no farther than his ear. The chairman read, looked once toward Mercer, then once toward Jared, and squared the paper against the wood with deliberate care. "Authentication update has arrived," he said. "Source chain confirms additional footage exists beyond the submitted segment." with intact timestamps. A murmur moved through the chamber, low and electric. The chairman raised his gaze to the witness table. Staff Sergeant Nguyen remained prepared to identify sequence events on full playback. Jared gave a single nod. Ready, Mr. Chairman. And he returned to stillness, not empty but loaded, like a post at dawn holding the line between forgetting and the facts now walking into the room. The chairman's words settled over the chamber like a command on a firing line, and for one beat, nobody breathed loudly enough to disturb it. Then Blaine Mercer leaned back in his chair with practiced ease, one arm draped along the wood, cufflinks flashing under the committee lights as if they were part of the argument. He wore confidence the way Jared wore his uniform, deliberately, visibly, as a statement of rank. The difference was provenance. Jared's came from standards met in silence. Mercer's came from cameras, donor dinners, and a career built on making aggression look like leadership. Mercer had not entered Congress through a slow apprenticeship in public service. He had purchased velocity. A decade earlier, he had turned a logistics startup into a defense-adjacent conglomerate, sold half of it at peak valuation, and spent the next election cycle presenting himself as a man who could run government like an enterprise. He was brilliant at panels, relentless in interviews, and allergic to restraint. His staff joked in private that he could smell a lens from across a hallway. His critics said he treated institutions as stages and people as props. Both descriptions were true often enough to matter. By his first year on appropriations oversight, he had become known for ambush hearings, theatrical binders, and edited clips timed for the evening news. Jared knew none of this from gossip. He knew it from dossiers and pattern recognition, the same disciplined observation that kept a perimeter secure. Mercer's public record showed more than ideology. It showed tempo. He interrupted to dominate rhythm. He framed opponents before evidence landed. He preferred fragments that could be clipped, titled, and sent into circulation before context assembled itself. In military terms, he fought for initiative, not accuracy. In politics, that strategy won often enough to become habit. He believed he could seize this room the same way, reduce tomb duty to optics, and cast a sentinel as a decorative expense. The chairman turned toward Mercer with formal restraint. Congressman, for the record, did you or did you not have prior contact with Staff Sergeant Nguyen before today's hearing? Mercer did not hesitate. I encountered him in a public terminal where he overstepped authority. Counsel lifted her eyes. Define overstepped. He obstructed a civilian path and initiated unnecessary force. The words were clean, legal, engineered. They were also built on omission. 3 weeks earlier, at Reagan National, a transfer detail had formed an honor corridor for a deceased Army pilot returning home. Not a parade, a passage. The flag-draped transfer case was moving from secured vehicle to restricted gate under escort, and everyone inside that lane had one job: keep the corridor clear, maintain dignity, control movement, protect family members walking nearest the case. Jared had been assigned outer lane control in dress uniform because ceremonial details in public spaces required both decorum and rapid response judgment. The corridor was marked by stanchions, rope, and personnel spacing, thin barriers that depended on compliance more than force. Mercer arrived at that terminal with 2 aides, 1 camera consultant, and impatience already visible in his stride. Witnesses remembered the same sharp detail. He kept checking his watch while talking, as if time itself owed him deference. When an airport staff member asked him to pause for 90 seconds, while the transfer crossed, he gave a clipped laugh and angled around the stanchion anyway. A retired sergeant near the lane told him, "Sir, Hold position, Mercer answered without slowing. I'm late for real work. Then he looked directly at Jared and delivered the line now in committee records. Move, toy soldier. You're blocking real work. The hearing room heard that quote read into evidence and went motionless in a different way than before. This was no longer rhetoric. It was transcript. Counsel continued. Congressman, did you place your hands on a wheelchair occupied by a minor during that incident? Mercer's jaw tightened. I redirected traffic around a bottleneck. The little girl's mother did not speak, but her knuckles turned white on the wheel handle beside her seat in the gallery. The retired Marine's cane tip pressed hard enough into the carpet to leave a faint mark. Jared stayed still, eyes forward, while the memory moved through him with clinical precision. Stanchion line flexing, one wheel drifting toward an unguarded edge, a bag abandoned near the lane mouth, voices rising out of phase. Threats in public spaces rarely arrived one at a time. They stacked. By 9:58 a.m., the committee clerk had entered 3 new exhibits into the record: TSA lane map, airport incident report, and witness affidavits from 2 veterans who had stood 6 feet from the corridor break. Mercer sensed momentum turning and pushed harder. This is exactly what I warned about, he said, volume climbing. Ceremonial personnel pretending to be law enforcement. Jared did not look at him. He did not need to. The fatal assumption had finally been spoken in full. That discipline in dress blues was ornamental. That rank, purchased in elections, outranked duty, earned in war. That a tomb guard existed to be moved aside by urgency, wealth, or convenience. Mercer saw symbols and presumed weakness. He saw ritual and presumed vacancy. He saw a quiet soldier and presumed he would stay inside whatever story power handed him. The chairman's gaze hardened. Staff Sergeant Nguyen is not on trial here, Congressman. Your submitted evidence is... Then play it, Mercer shot back. That is exactly what we will do, the chairman said. Counsel signaled the technician. A fresh drive was seated. Hash values matched. Chain of custody signatures appeared line by line on the side monitor, where staff could see them. The process was procedural, almost dry, but everyone in the room understood its meaning. No edits, no missing span, no narrative shortcuts. Truth was about to arrive at full frame rate. Jared remained a figure of controlled geometry at the witness table, but inside him every system had moved to readiness. His breathing settled into 4-count cycles. Peripheral hearing widened. He mapped the room again without turning his head. 2 Capitol police officers at rear exits, 1 plainclothes protective detail near the side aisle, chairman's counsel at 3 steps from the control station, Mercer's lead aide with a phone half hidden beneath briefing papers, likely sending rapid guidance to comm staff outside. None of this changed his posture. It refined his timing. The gallery had grown denser during the verification delay. Staffers, who had no seat, stood too deep along the walls. Reporters pressed shoulder to shoulder behind the final row. Veterans in unit caps formed a quiet line near the back doors, not obstructing, simply present. Interns and junior staffers stood on their toes to see the monitors. Phones lowered now, expressions stripped of performance. The little girl in the wheelchair sat very straight, folded flag pin catching light each time she shifted a fraction. Her mother's hand rested on her shoulder, steady and protective. The old Marine with oxygen tubing had moved 1 step into the aisle for a clearer view, his son hovering close without interfering. At 10:01 a.m., a committee staffer slipped to the chairman and whispered that General Annalise Whitaker had been notified and was en route with Military District Legal Counsel. The chairman gave 1 short nod and kept his eyes on the screen. That single line of information changed the room's emotional climate. Not louder, heavier. Authority was converging. Mercer saw the whisper, misread it as theater, and smirked toward the cameras. I assume we are done with mythology and moving to facts. Jared's pulse did not change, though a muscle along his left forearm tightened beneath the sleeve and released. In Helmand, he had learned that men who declared victory early usually mistook noise for control. In Syria, he had learned that crowded civilian spaces could shift from routine to crisis in less than a breath. At the tomb, he had learned to hold both lessons inside absolute stillness. Outwardly, he was ceremonial discipline. Inwardly, he was an active sensor grid. The technician brought up the recovered file. Timestamp visible. Audio intact. Duration, 0 minutes 23 seconds. A murmur swept the chamber and vanished. Silence, the chairman said. Silence obeyed. Mercer leaned forward, elbows on the dais, as if proximity could influence pixels. His aide slid a note toward him. He did not read it. Confidence had carried him this far, and he trusted it more than counsel. The platinum at his cuffs flashed again when he folded his hands. He looked for a moment less like a lawmaker than a man waiting to watch his own ad buy go live. Jared watched nothing and everything. He kept his gaze fixed above the witness rail, but he heard the subtle cues, the faint rattle in the Marine's breathing tube, the rustle of legal paper as counsel prepared annotation tabs, the distant click of a reporter locking focus on her lens, the little girl whispering numbers under her breath as if cadence could steady the room. 1, 2, 3. She stopped at 21 out of habit and started again. The sound barely carried, but Jared caught it and let it anchor him to the same vow that had carried him across dawn. The chairman lifted the gavel, then lowered it without striking. Final check, he said. Counsel? Authenticated, counsel replied. Uncut sequence. Chain complete? Complete. The chairman looked to Jared. Staff Sergeant, you may identify events as they occur. Jared inclined his head once. Understood. Seconds stretched, not metaphorically, but physically, each one crowded with expectation. The room felt suspended between two narratives, one polished and already half-published, the other waiting in raw sequence. People in the gallery leaned forward at the same angle without realizing they were doing it. A reporter in the back forgot to blink. The old Marine's hand closed around his cane. The little girl's mother whispered, almost inaudible, "Steady, sweetheart," though it was unclear whether she meant her daughter or herself. Mercer tapped the desk once. Play. The technician's finger hovered over the control. Jared remained motionless, face carved from discipline, white gloves still against dark wool, every muscle coiled beneath ceremony, every instinct firing under skin that revealed nothing. He waited for the first frame to move and for sequence at last to do what rhetoric could not. The frame moved. Cold airport light flooded the hearing room monitors, flattening every color to steel and glass, and the timestamp in the corner began counting from 9:17:13 with an indifference no human witness could match. The corridor at Reagan National came into view in full geometry this time. Stanchions aligned, rope line taut, transfer team in measured motion, family members positioned near the inside lane, Jared on outer control in dress blues, shoulders square and feet set at the exact angle that allowed both ceremonial bearing and rapid lateral response. The difference between theater and duty appeared in a single second of uncut sequence. He was not performing for bystanders. He was scanning. Mercer entered frame from the left, pace aggressive, suit coat open, phone in one hand, impatience visible in the whip of his stride. One aide reached toward his elbow. He shook the hand off. He crossed the marked boundary without checking lane direction, without acknowledging the escort detail, and without stopping when an airport staffer raised a palm and spoke. Audio carried clear. "Sir, hold for transfer." Mercer did not slow. "Move." Then the line the chamber had already heard struck again, now with context and tone attached. "Move, toy soldier! You're blocking real work." Gasps broke across the hearing gallery at once, raw and involuntary, because contempt sounded different when no one could claim misquote. On the monitor, the little girl's wheelchair sat just inside the corridor edge beside her mother, the folded flag pin visible even in grainy footage. Mercer's hand closed around the push handle and yanked to create space for his own path. The chair pivoted sharply out of alignment. Jared moved on instinct, older than politics and faster than argument. One step, shoulder turn, gloved hand to the chair frame, not the child. He stabilized the wheels, set the chair back inside the lane, and placed his own body between Mercer and the transfer passage in one continuous action, so clean it looked choreographed, until the audio exposed urgency. At the same instant, an unattended roller bag drifted from a nearby bench area into the corridor mouth, tugged by the wake of passing foot traffic. Jared's eyes snapped to it for a fraction, measured distance, then returned to Mercer, because threat hierarchy in a crowded civilian terminal required split allocation, not tunnel vision. A Federal Protective Service officer entered frame from the right, already moving toward the bag. A second officer signaled stop to oncoming pedestrians. The transfer team never broke cadence. In the hearing chamber, nobody whispered now. Even keyboards were silent. The clip ran 3 more seconds. Mercer tried to surge around Jared's right side, shoulder lowered like a man testing whether rank could physically bend procedure. Jared pivoted with him. Minimal force, precise placement, no strike, no shove, only a hard barrier of trained posture and lawful command. His voice came through the monitor with the same cadence he used at the witness table, calm enough to sound final. "You will stand down. This passage belongs to the fallen." The sentence landed like a gate closing. Mercer froze on screen, not from impact, from collision with authority he had not anticipated. Behind him, 2 veterans in civilian jackets stepped into supportive position without touching him, presence alone reinforcing the boundary. The little girl's mother recentered the wheelchair and held her daughter close at the shoulder. The transfer case moved through the lane under flag and escort, uninterrupted, exactly as protocol demanded. When the 23-second file ended, it ended on order restored, officers controlling perimeter, bag secured for screening, corridor clear, family protected from crowd pressure, Mercer held outside the lane with no injury and no pretense left. The hearing room sat in stunned stillness for one suspended beat. Then sound returned in fragments. A reporter near the back whispered, "Full sequence." An intern said, barely audible, "He lied." The retired Marine with oxygen tubing closed his eyes and exhaled through his nose. One long, measured breath that looked like release. The little girl in the gallery looked from the monitor to Jared and back again, as if confirming that the same still figure at the witness table was the one who had moved like a shield in the terminal. At 10:02 a.m., the chairman set both hands on the dais and spoke with formal precision that left no room for spin. "Let the record reflect the uncut footage contradicts the submitted narrative in material ways." Mercer reached for his microphone first. "That bag was irrelevant to the contact. This is selective interpretation." Counsel answered before the chairman needed to. "Congressman, Federal Protective Service incident note is time-stamped to the same second span. The bag trigger and your lane breach are concurrent." The staff sergeant's response was proportionate and compliant. Mercer's jaw flexed. Compliant to whose standard? Jared did not raise his voice. To the standard that keeps a dignified transfer intact. The chairman turned to Mercer. Did you instruct staff to provide only the shortened segment? Mercer opened his folder, closed it again, and bought 3 seconds with paper noise. My office submitted what was provided to us. The chairman's eyes did not leave him. By whom? Mercer did not answer. The rear doors opened before the silence could decay into argument. General Annalise Whitaker entered with committee counsel from Military District Legal, service ribbons aligned over a uniform worn with the same severe exactness Jared carried, and the room reacted as one organism recognizing hierarchy. Staffers stepped aside. Reporters lowered their chins and lenses to keep her in frame. Even Mercer straightened reflexively before he remembered to look annoyed. Whitaker stopped at the witness rail, saluted the chair with crisp economy, and placed a sealed evidence envelope on the dais. Mr. Chairman, chain packet requested. General, the chairman said. State your purpose for the record. Commanding General, Military District of Washington. I am here to authenticate source custody for Reagan national footage, confirm advisory communications, and provide sworn clarification regarding attempted suppression of contextual material. The last phrase hit the chamber harder than any shouted insult had. Counsel broke the envelope seal under camera view and withdrew printed logs, signature pages, and a communications transcript. Whitaker continued in a voice that carried without strain and did not need emphasis to cut. Original 23-second file was preserved on airport security server and mirrored to FPS archive. At 7:11 yesterday, a congressional liaison from Congressman Mercer's office requested an edited public-facing extract and specifically asked whether contextual seconds could be omitted for brevity. At 8:03, MDW Legal advised in writing that omission would create a misleading representation. At 8:19, the same liaison replied, quote, "We only need the part where contact occurs," end quote. A low wave of disbelief moved through the gallery and died quickly when the chairman lifted 2 fingers for silence. Mercer leaned toward his microphone, face tight. General, are you accusing a member of Congress of evidence tampering? Whitaker met his stare without heat. I am testifying to documented correspondence and custody records. The committee may apply its own legal terms. She handed counsel a second sheet. Additionally, Staff Sergeant Nguyen filed an immediate post-incident statement at Reagan National. His statement notes dual priorities: maintain honor corridor and stabilize bystander mobility, while FPS addressed an unattended object. The statement was accurate in all material details. The chairman scanned the page, then looked up. Congressman Mercer, do you dispute the authenticity of these records? Mercer's hands, so steady earlier, shifted against each other once before settling. I dispute characterization. Do you dispute authenticity? No response. The chairman repeated the question. Do you dispute authenticity? Mercer stared at the monitor now dark above him, then at the packet in counsel's hands, then at the cameras he had counted on. No. The word was small. It carried anyway. By 10:07 a.m., the committee moved from spectacle to consequence with a speed that felt almost surgical. The chairman recognized 2 members for procedural motions. First, strike Mercer's amendment language reducing Tomb Guard operational funding as ceremonial redundancy. Second, refer potential misconduct in evidentiary submission to House Ethics for review of intent and staff direction. Each motion required debate. Neither took long. Veterans in the audience did not clap. They stood in grave silence, which was heavier than applause. Votes were called aloud. Aye. 1 no from Mercer arrived thin and late. The tally carried by wide margin. The chairman gavelled once. Amendment fails. Ethics referral adopted. Record will include full footage and authenticated chain materials. Mercer sat back in his chair as if the wood had shifted under him. The platinum at his cuffs still flashed when he moved, but now it looked ornamental rather than commanding, expensive metal with no authority behind it. He asked for recognition. The chair denied it, pending next agenda item. For the first time that morning, Blaine Mercer had nothing to say that changed the room. Whitaker turned slightly toward Jared. Protocol held, no dramatic gesture, no speech for cameras. She gave a single professional nod that acknowledged standard met under pressure. Jared returned the nod by a fraction and resumed absolute stillness at the witness table, the same discipline as at dawn, the same vow carried through 2 worlds in one day. In the gallery, the old Marine touched 2 fingers to the brim of his cap. The little girl mirrored him with a small, solemn motion of her own. Her mother's eyes filled but did not break. Around them, interns, reporters, Gold Star families, and staffers remained standing in a chamber that had entered the morning ready to cut memory down to a budget line and now sat face to face with what those lines actually guarded. The chairman moved to the next item on paper, because institutions healed by procedure as much as by passion. Yet the moral center of the hearing had already been set. Earned honor had met purchased influence in open session, and influence had yielded when full sequence came to light. Jared kept his gaze fixed above the witness rail, breathing even, white gloves still, posture exact. He had spoken when asked, moved when required, and then returned to silence. In that silence lived Hellman dust, Syrian smoke, Pike Callahan's unfinished sentence, dawn mist on Arlington marble, and the unbroken cadence that turned remembrance into active duty. The chairman recessed the hearing at 10:19 a.m., and procedure took over with the same cold precision that had just dismantled performance. Committee counsel sealed the recovered drive in a tamper bag, logged the hash values on camera, and handed custody to the House evidence clerk. The printed chain packet from General Whitaker's envelope was stamped, copied, and entered as a protected exhibit. The original envelope itself went into a second archive sleeve, signed across the seal by counsel, the clerk, and a Capitol Police witness. Nothing floated loose. Every item that had carried truth into the room was tagged, stored, and accountable. Near the dais, the chairman kept his voice low as he gave final directives. Full clip to public record by close of business. Ethics referral transmitted today, not tomorrow. Counsel nodded and made the calls in sequence. Speaker muted, each confirmation written by hand in the margin of her docket. Federal Protective Service answered the second call and confirmed the airport incident addendum had already been uploaded. Unattended bags screened and cleared as non-threat. Owner identified, no hazardous contents, response actions appropriate. Strange detail that Mercer had tried to dismiss was now fixed in federal record. Timed to the second beside his lane breach and Jared's intervention. Mercer remained seated while most of the room emptied around him. His lead aide, the one who had slipped notes during playback, stood at his shoulder with a legal pad and a face gone pale under studio makeup. He began twice to speak and stopped twice, pen hovering over blank paper. At last he said, "Sir, Ethics Counsel wants immediate—" Mercer lifted a hand without looking at him. The aide fell silent and never finished the sentence. 10 minutes later, when counsel asked whether he would voluntarily preserve all related office communications, he answered through clenched restraint, "My office will comply with a lawful request." It was the only complete statement he gave before leaving by the side corridor. Under camera glare, he could not command. In the center aisle, the journalist, who had lowered her notebook at Arlington, stepped toward Jared as soon as protocol allowed. She held no microphone now, only her pen and a folded credential. "Staff Sergeant," she said, "but for accuracy, one line." Why ask for the full 23 seconds? Jared kept his posture exact, eyes level, and answered with the same calm that had carried the hearing. "Because sequence is respect." She wrote it down, nodded once, and did not ask for another quote. By noon, her network posted the full uncut clip with timestamp, chain notes, and the corrected headline. The 7-second version kept circulating in smaller corners, but stripped of context, it collapsed under its own edits. By 12:47 p.m., the intern who had mouthed "no way" in the first shock stood outside the chamber beside the retired Marine and offered an awkward, earnest apology for how little he had understood before that morning. The old Marine adjusted his oxygen tubing, looked him in the eye, and answered without cruelty. "Learn fast, son. Freedom bills come due whether you read the invoice or not." The intern nodded, shoulders squared in a new way, then walked back inside to help staff upload the public exhibits on time. General Whitaker found Jared in a quiet hallway, near the secure elevator bay, where noise from the press pool reached them only as muffled static. "Staff Sergeant Nguyen," she said. "You upheld standard under provocation and preserved dignity in 2 theaters in 1 day." He answered, "Ma'am." She studied him for a moment with the measured gaze of a commander who recognized fatigue and discipline occupying the same body. "Your evening watch stands," she said. "Return to Arlington. Let the post close this day." He gave one sharp nod. "Yes, ma'am." He changed in silence at the barracks staging room before departure. Ceremonial details checked again under brighter lights than dawn had offered. Kepi angle corrected by a 1/4 inch. Brass repolished. Gloves replaced. Rifle issue verified and signed. The administrative sergeant on duty handed him a small property envelope. "Personal effects from hearing transit," he said. Inside was a folded copy of the committee witness card, and nothing else. Jared signed receipt, then signed transfer back to secure locker, because even paper carried chain when the day had turned historic. The envelope was shelved in his assigned compartment and logged at 3:06 p.m., thread closed. By 5:32 p.m., Arlington had entered that hour, when daylight softens but does not surrender, and the cemetery seemed to hold both afternoon and evening at once. Wind moved low across the hill, lifting the edges of coats and the corners of programs held in gloved hands. The marble of the tomb took on a warmer tone under the descending sun, while the white headstones beyond remained cool and constant, rank after rank stepping down the slopes like silent formation. Visitors gathered at respectful distance, more than usual for a weekday evening, many of them drawn by the clip that had crossed every screen before supper. Jared took his post. His boots struck the mat with that same measured report, sharp enough to carry through murmur and wind. The counted march resumed. 21 paces, a held pause, a turn, then the cycle again. The ritual did not acknowledge hearings, votes, headlines, or men undone by their own edits. It acknowledged only the fallen and the living duty to remember them. To the crowd, he was again the unreadable sentinel, face carved from discipline, white gloves pristine, rifle steady at exact angle. Inside, the day's noise thinned each time his heel found count. Among the visitors stood people from both worlds that had collided in the hearing room. The nurse in scrubs had returned, jacket zipped to her throat against the chill. The high school boys stood quieter than at dawn, phones in their pockets, caps in hand. The young staffer, who had once checked his screen, now watched without touching his device. The journalist remained at the edge with notebook closed, witnessing instead of collecting. Near the front rail, the little girl in the wheelchair waited with her mother. The red scarf sat straighter this time, pinned at the shoulder against the wind. In her lap rested a small velvet pouch held in both hands, as if carrying glass. Beside them, the retired Marine stood with cane planted, an oxygen line clear, refusing the folding chair again. He tracked Jared's cadence with tiny movements of his lips, counting the last numbers under his breath. At the completion of a cycle, relief timing opened a narrow corridor for authorized approach. A sergeant from the detail checked the mother's pass and guided them to the designated point without disrupting sequence. Jared halted on command, pivoted to inspection stance, and held. The little girl looked up at him with solemn concentration, then opened the pouch. She drew out a coin no wider than 2 fingers, bronze edge worn smooth, unit crest engraved at center. Her voice came quiet but steady. "This was my dad's." She swallowed and continued. "Mom says he carried it on every flight. I want you to have it when you walk." Jared lowered his gaze the permitted fraction, enough to meet her eyes without breaking bearing. "I receive it with honor," he said. He did not take it directly in post-formation. Protocol mattered, even in tenderness. The relief sergeant accepted the coin on his behalf, announced receipt for the log, and placed it in a clear protective sleeve marked with date, time, and donor name at the mother's request. The mother signed the small card attached to the sleeve. The sergeant signed witness. The coin would be secured in Jared's personal effects case until off-post, then mounted in his private shadow box beside Pike's name tape and a faded patrol photo. The gift was not lost to sentiment or process. It was protected by both. The little girl gave a tiny nod, mission complete. Her mother's eyes shone but held. "Thank you," she whispered. Not for the hearing, not only for the airport, but for the whole hard architecture of discipline that had kept her child safe in public and seen in grief. Jared answered in formal cadence. "Your father is honored here." The retired Marine shifted his cane, drew one careful breath through the tubing, and spoke to no one in particular, voice rough with age and certainty. "That's what honor looks like." A few heads turned toward him. No one disagreed. The sergeant signaled clearance. The mother guided the wheelchair back to the rail. The crowd settled again. Jared resumed motion. He completed the measured cycle and flowed into the next without a break. The flag above the plaza lifted and snapped once in the evening wind, then streamed steady against the sky, fading from pale gold to deep blue. Shadows lengthened between headstones, filling the rows without softening their order. Somewhere down the slope, a bell marked the hour, thin and distant, echoing the one that had sounded in the morning when this day still looked ordinary. At the rail, the Marine counted softly through another cycle. The little girl counted with him, finger tapping the armrest, both of them stopping at 21 and waiting through the pause as if they had always known how. At 6:14 p.m., Committee Council sent the final confirmation to Military District Legal, full footage posted, chain documents published, referral filed, amendment dead. The message reached Whitaker's phone as she stood back from the plaza under the trees, observing without fanfare. She read, locked the screen, and looked once toward the sentinel on the mat, then turned away and left the hill to its own authority. Jared completed another pass, another turn, another measured stillness. The day had tested every seam between sacred duty and public power, and the seams had held. Not because outrage was louder, not because cameras favored him, but because sequence was honored, records were kept, and discipline refused to break for convenience. The lesson settled without speechifying. Earned honor did not need theatrical volume. It needed witnesses, standards and men willing to hold the line when memory was treated like surplus. Dusk gathered fully. Marble cooled, headstones whitened against darkening grass. Boots met stone in exact cadence, each report carrying across the plaza like a vow renewed in real time. 21 steps, pause, turn, repeat. The tomb stood in solemn permanence. The flag moved above it. The crowd kept its prayerful silence, and Staff Sergeant Jared Nguyen continued his watch, where history was not merely remembered, but guarded.